Space Marines come in two flavours, Firstborn Marines and Primaris. While there are law justifications for the two being separate entities, Primaris were essentially an attempt to rescale and refresh the existing Space Marine range without having to put the current Space Marine range out of commission. As such, it's still possible to field the older, smaller looking Marine units alongside the larger scale Primaris. In fact, there are tactical advantages to doing so, but aesthetically, they look quite a bit different, especially when it comes to scale, which is something I hope to remedy. I'm Pete the Wargamer, and in this video, I'll be showing you how to kitbash some true scale Terminators. Now, frequent viewers of the channel may remember me tackling this in a live stream some time ago. In that video, I used this Primaris Aggressor as the basis of the conversion. However, since then, we've had the new Gravis armoured heavy intercessors released. These are much better for two reasons. First of all, they come in units of 5 rather than 3, which means they're more in line with the Terminator unit sizes. Secondly, the armour around the lower abdomen of the heavy intercessors more closely resembles the original Terminators, rather than having the tabards and extra armour plating. So, I began by removing all the components required to build the legs and torso of a heavy intercessor from its sprue, before cleaning up the mould lines and remaining sprue tabs using my knife. Gravis armour is not too far off the original Terminator armour in many aspects. The chest and leg armour, for example, is much like the original, albeit in a larger scale. But the main differences that I would need to incorporate are the helmet and the large boxy armour that sits above and behind the head. The Aggressor armour features this to a degree, but it's more rounded out and it's more like a larger version of the Mark 10 power armour. So by including this rear half of the torso, we can go a long way to recreating that Terminator style. I took the front half of the heavy intercessor armour and rear plate from the Terminator kit. Upon comparing these, I decided to clip away the protruding semicircles from the torso front. Removing these resulted in a surprisingly good fit between the two. There wasn't much difference in the width, and the remaining alterations that needed to be done were fairly straightforward. The back half of the Terminator torso was missing the rounded collar insert. Now this comes as part of the piece that makes up the front half of the Terminator's torso, so this needed to be removed. I began with my saw. I cut through the vertical uprights and used an existing diagonal seam as a guide. This meant that I could match up the position of the cuts on either side of the collar without having to measure. Once the collar had been removed, I then did another dry fit of the collar against the Terminator back plate, the heavy intercessor front plate and Terminator head. This allowed me to double check how everything was fitting together and helped to decide upon the next step of adjustments. During this comparison, I noticed that there were some slightly protruding parts from the Terminator half of the torso. These were trimmed back using my knife to create a better join between the two parts. Now that the Terminator and heavy intercessor torso halves were fitting together nicely, I had another problem. The lower back and the rear of the pelvis area were missing, as these were a part of the rear half of the heavy intercessor's torso. So I needed to make a cut to ensure that these missing parts could still fit, even with the Terminator parts in place. To make sure that the cut would be made to the correct location, I began with the heavy intercessor front and the Terminator back. I made a mark to denote the bottom edge of the Terminator part on each side with a pencil. This meant that when I attached the heavy intercessor rear, I could continue these marks across the back in a straight line, giving me the exact point that I would need to saw through. With my saw blade, I began my cutting using the line as a guide. Once I had removed the top half of the torso away from the bottom, I brought the other components together to check the fit. From here, I could see that I still needed to make some further cuts. I began sawing again and removed a little bit more. Generally speaking, you're best cutting away less than is required, as you can always go back and cut more. If you cut away too much, this is usually harder to fix, so always keep that in mind. After the second cut, there were just a few small tweaks that still need to be made, and these were performed using my clippers and my knife. Before I began assembling anything, I wanted to make sure that I didn't need to make any more adjustments to the components. It's usually easy to cut, file and clip while the parts are disassembled, because it's very easy to break apart glued together parts during this process. So once again, I did a dry fit and noticed that the way the head was sitting was a little high and that the gorget would get in the way of the head turning around, so I decided to trim it back. For this, I used a knife to incrementally reduce the height. I made it so that it was a little lower down in the centre and then went slightly higher as it swept around the sides. Once I'd finished, I checked the head again and made sure that it was now sitting a little better. Now that all the required adjustments had been made, I set about assembling all the components together. I started by attaching the collar to the back half of the torso, before gluing the front and back of the torso together. Finally, I added the bottom half of the heavy intercessor. With the torso built, I could attach the legs. I used the heavy intercessor legs here as they are sufficiently bulky enough to represent Terminator armor, whilst also being much taller and much more upright compared to the power squat pose that the older kits had. However, the intercessor legs feature a cable running from the legs to the hip, which is something that isn't present in the Terminator set, so I decided to remove it. I used my clippers to first clip away the pipe from the leg before removing it from the hip plate. Both of these components were then cleaned up with my knife, shaving them back until they were both smooth surfaces. This was then repeated on the other legs before they were both glued to the torso. At this point, my torso and legs had been assembled, but I still had a huge hole in the back of the torso between the Terminator component and the heavy intercessor's lower half. To fill in this gap, I chose to use some perfect plastic putty. For gap filling jobs like this, I prefer to use this putty rather than green stuff because it's quick drying and can be easily filed and smoothed out once it is dried. It comes pre-mixed in a tube and just needs to be applied with a sculpting tool. I applied enough to fill in all the gaps before adding just a little water to help smooth things out. Anywhere that I'd overspilled was then cleaned up with a damp brush. After the putty had been allowed to dry, 2 to 3 hours is usually enough, I then use my knife to smooth things out again and generally tidy up any further problems between the joins. The next area to tackle was the head, but the existing socket wouldn't really work, so I grabbed myself some green stuff, cut away a section of the blue and yellow and mixed them together. You'll notice that I avoided the center point where the halves touch. Using this can sometimes result in lumps of already cured green stuff getting into your mixture, which is less than desirable. With the green stuff mixed, I checked the fit of the Terminator head once again. From this, I could see that I needed to both raise the head and fill in the gap too. I started with the gap, and to fill this in, I rolled out a length of green stuff and pressed it into that gap. Using a sculpting tool dipped in some Vaseline, I then proceeded to smooth it out and blend it into the rest of the neck joint. I found that the rounded handle of the paintbrush is particularly helpful with this. Now that the gap had been filled, I just needed to create a better support for the Terminator helmet. I started by rolling out a small ball of green stuff. This was then pressed into the center of the neck and squashed slightly with the handle of a paintbrush. To ensure that the depression was the correct size and shape, I brought in the Terminator head. I positioned the head into the desired final position, squashing down the green stuff as I did so. Once removed, I was left with a new neck joint that was the perfect size and shape for holding the head. While the green stuff was still workable, I used my knife and sculpting tool to create a seam around the edge of the neck. Chances are that this wouldn't be visible, but on the off chance that it was, I wanted the neck to have a similar ridge style to other Space Marine helmets. I finished off by adding the head again to ensure that I hadn't affected the position before leaving the green stuff to cure overnight. By this point, the only remaining parts to add were the arms. I opted to just use Terminator arms and shoulders for this, as they would not only help to continue the Terminator aesthetic, but they were already a decent enough size for this upscale conversion. However, I did decide to adjust their placement slightly. If I'd attached them to their normal locations, they would have looked far too high up. After lengthening the torso and the legs, having the shoulders above the head would have created a very top-heavy looking model, so I decided to position them a little lower. To ensure a stronger bond at this new location, I decided to pin the arms into place. To do this, I used my pin vise with a 1mm drill bit and drilled a hole into the torso where I would want the arm to be placed. I followed this up with a second hole drilled directly into the shoulder of the Terminator arm. I then proceeded to glue a length of 1mm thick steel Floris wire into the shoulder hole using some superglue. I gave this a little while to dry and then clipped the wire so that only a few millimeters were left protruding. This was then glued into the hole in the torso, completing the fit and resulting in a much stronger bond. This was then repeated on the other side, and finally, the original Terminator shoulder pads were added. Normally, at this stage in the video, I show you the completed model on the turntable and talk about the conversion, but I found that there was something missing from the model. You may have seen the model posted to my community page, and a lot of you commented on how narrow the waist looked, and I agreed. The silhouette of the model didn't look as bulky as maybe it should have, so I decided to pad out that midsection just a little bit more. I still had some unused Terminator legs left over from the conversion, so using my saw, I began to cut away the armor plates from the upper thigh. These were then cleaned up and thinned out with a combination of my knife and a file, until I was left with just the plate itself. This was then painted up in the same manner as the rest of the model. The problem I now faced was attaching this to the already painted miniature. Of course, if you're following along with this guide yourself, you would want to do this before you start painting. So I carefully removed the plate from the wire that I was using to hold the component. I then compared it against the model to get an idea of where the contact points would be. These were then cleaned up using my knife, and remember, gluing painted components together will only make the bond as strong as the paint itself, so always make sure that you do this. Once clear, I used some superglue to attach the part to the waist. Superglue is usually a little thicker than plastic glue, so it's less likely to run and damage the surrounding paintwork. Once this was done, I repeated it on the other side of the waist, which left me with this. And here we have the completed, scaled up Terminator. So now that everything has been fully painted and based, we can go back and decide whether or not this solves the problem that I outlined at the beginning of this video. The difference in scale between older and newer Space Marine units. It certainly has the height. Against the Primaris Marine, this Terminator is definitely taller, so we solved the problem of him looking undersized for such an elite unit. But there is something about the finished model that is a little strange. Now I think this could simply be a bit of cognitive dissonance, which is quite a fancy word for a channel that deals with toy soldiers. Many of us have just gotten used to the idea of Terminators being short, squat and boxy for so many years that we think that is just how they should be, when in fact they are only really like that as a result of the technology and sculpting quality that was available at the time that they were originally made. So of course, seeing these more iconic Terminator aesthetics on a more elongated frame looks almost out of place. Even though the armour is in fact bigger than it used to be, by losing that compressed aspect, it no longer looks as heavy as it used to be. More modern kits like Tartarus and Cataphractii are good examples of how Terminator armour should have been proportioned. They have more realistic build, yet still have the bulk, but because their design was quite different to the classic Indomitus style armour, it didn't have that same effect. So let me know what you think of this upscaled Terminator in the comments, and if you enjoyed this kit bashing video, then please do leave me a like along with your suggestions for other units that you would like to see me upscale in the future. And with that, the final thing to say is a massive thank you to my supporters. Currently, my top supporters on Patreon are Stuart Smith, Jeremy Kaup, Jake, Douglas Wilson, and Daniel Dowling. So a big thank you to you guys, and if you also support me on Patreon, buy me a coffee, or you just use my affiliates links. And your help is what keeps this channel alive, and it's what allows me to build these different kinds of conversions for you. If you would like to help me out, then you can check out my description for all of the relevant links. So until next time, thanks for watching, and goodbye.